On the 12th of April, 1945, the toughest fighting general the United States Army had ever produced walked around the back of a wooden shed in a forest in Germany and vomited against the wall. He was 59 years old. He had commanded men in battle on 3 continents. He had written in his own diary that he loved war more than anything else a man could love. He had never done this before. In that same moment, 4,000 miles away, the President of the United States raised one hand to his temple, said one sentence, and lost consciousness forever. 2 men, 2 moments, one afternoon that neither of them survived unchanged. This is what happened and why it still matters. The German lines west of the Rhine had collapsed. Entire divisions were surrendering in villages. Roads were choked with soldiers walking east and civilians walking anywhere at all. The Reich that had been promised to last 1,000 years was coming apart at every seam, and the men who had built it were beginning to run. On the night of the 22nd of March, without ceremony and almost without announcement, elements of the Third Army crossed the Rhine near a small town called Oppenheim. They crossed in wooden assault boats in the dark under a sky that was quiet for the first time in weeks. Patton waited on the west bank until the far side was secure. Then he walked out onto the pontoon bridge that his engineers had built, stopped in the middle of it, and urinated into the river. His own photographer was there. Patton had made sure of that. He wanted his men to see him do it. He wanted the Germans to hear about it. He wanted history to have a record of exactly where he had been standing and exactly what he had thought of the country he was crossing into. Then he kept walking. The Third Army pushed east faster than the maps could be updated. Patton's tanks entered Thuringia. His infantry followed. Town after town, road after road. Somewhere ahead of them, in a section of forest south of the town of Gotha, was a place the SS had given a code name. The Americans did not know it existed. They were about to. Ohrdruf did not appear on any Allied intelligence map. That was not an accident. Officially, Ohrdruf was a construction site. 3 Roman letters, S3, on a small circle of paperwork inside a small circle of men who had been ordered never to speak about it outside that circle. To anyone looking from the outside, there was nothing there. Forest, wire, a few wooden buildings visible from the air, if you knew to look for them. No one had known to look. In November of 1944, with the Reich collapsing on both fronts, the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office had established a new subcamp of Buchenwald in the forest 30 miles to the west. The paperwork listed no name, only the code, S3. The prisoners knew what S3 was. They were the ones building it. Their assignment, if such a word can be used for what was done to them, was to dig tunnels through the mountainside near a place called Mühlberg. The tunnels would house a communications center for the final defense of the Reich, a hardened facility buried deep enough to survive bombing, deep enough to survive almost anything. There was something else the tunnels might eventually hide, something the German High Command referred to in internal documents as the Führersonderzug, Hitler's train, his mobile command post, his escape route from Berlin if Berlin fell. The men digging those tunnels were being killed doing it. By late March of 1945, more than 10,000 prisoners were held inside Ohrdruf. They had come from every country the Reich had occupied. They were Jewish and Polish and Hungarian and Russian and French. They lived in barracks that were not designed for human occupancy. They were shot when they slowed down. They were beaten when they did not slow down. They were starved as a matter of deliberate policy because S3 was not a labor camp in any sense that would have been recognized in Geneva or Washington. S3 was a system for using human beings until they were no longer useful and then disposing of them in a shed near the parade ground. That is what it was. At the beginning of April 1945, 2 men in Berlin made 2 completely different decisions about what to do with the camps. They made these decisions at almost the same moment. Neither man knew what the other was doing. The first man was Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He was 41 years old. He was the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, the head of the SS intelligence and police apparatus that ran the entire concentration camp system. On the 3rd of April, Kaltenbrunner issued a direct order for the immediate evacuation of Ohrdruf. The prisoners were to be marched to Buchenwald, 30 miles away. Anyone who could not walk was to be dealt with on the spot. The phrase used in the order, dealt with on the spot, meant exactly what it sounds like it meant. The second man was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer SS, Kaltenbrunner's superior, the man who had built the entire camp system from the ground up. And Himmler, at that exact moment, was doing something his own subordinate did not know about and would not have understood. On the 7th of March, 1945, weeks before Kaltenbrunner's order, weeks before the Rhine crossing, Himmler had arranged a meeting with a Swiss intermediary named Benoit Musi. Musi was in his 30s. He was the son of Jean-Marie Musi, a former president of Switzerland, and he had been used before as a quiet channel between the SS and the outside world. Himmler used the meeting to make Musi a promise. Buchenwald, he said, would be left intact for the Allied liberation. It would be handed over quietly, without violence, without destruction, no death march, no last-minute executions. The camp would simply be there waiting when the Americans arrived, a gesture of cooperation from a man who still believed that cooperation might save him. The gesture was not aimed at Musi. It was not aimed at Switzerland. It was aimed at one specific man. Himmler wanted the gesture to reach General Dwight David Eisenhower because Himmler was already thinking about what came after the war. He was thinking about negotiation. He was thinking about his own survival in a world where the Reich no longer existed. He believed, and this belief would destroy him, that he was someone the Americans might want to deal with, that he was someone who could offer something in exchange for something. Kaltenbrunner knew none of this, and by the time Himmler found out, through his intelligence chief, Walter Schellenberg, who had heard it from Musi himself, that the evacuation of Ohrdruf had already begun, it was too late to stop it cleanly. Himmler issued a halt order on the 10th of April. He was 3 days too late. Whatever Himmler had wanted the Americans to find at Buchenwald was not what they were going to find at Ohrdruf. The evacuation had already become something else entirely, and the road between Ohrdruf and Buchenwald had already become something that no halt order could undo. The evacuation of Ohrdruf was a death march in the most literal meaning of that phrase. Along the route between the camp and Buchenwald, SS men, joined by members of the local Volkssturm militia and by boys from the Hitler Youth, killed an estimated 1,000 prisoners. They shot the ones who fell behind. They shot the ones who tried to run. They shot the ones who simply looked at them the wrong way, if looking the wrong way was the reason that day. Mass graves along the route were reopened. The bodies inside them were burned to hide what had been done to them, to hide how many there were, to hide when it had happened and who had given the orders. Not everyone could be marched. Inside the camp, in a section called the Nordlager, several hundred prisoners were too sick or too weak to move. The SS did not want to leave them alive for the Americans to find, but they also did not want to spend the day shooting men one by one inside the barracks. So they used a lie. They announced that food was being distributed on the parade ground. Men who had not eaten a real meal in weeks pulled themselves out of their bunks. They limped. They were carried. Some of them crawled. They made their way to the parade ground because they had been told for the last time in their lives that there was food waiting for them. When they arrived, the guards were waiting with rifles. The bodies were left where they fell. Then the SS ran. Not all together, not all in the same direction. Some tried to finish burning the pile of corpses that was still stacked in a clearing near the perimeter. Some scattered lime by hand in the shed near the gate, hoping to reduce the smell enough to buy time. The lime was not spread with any care. It was thrown in handfuls by men who were already thinking about the tree line. They left it anyway. Then they left into the woods, into civilian clothes, into whatever version of the future a man like that still believed was available to him. They had been in a hurry. The blood on the parade ground had not yet darkened. Some of it was still wet. Just after sunrise on the 4th of April, 1945, the leading elements of the 4th Armored Division of the United States Third Army came to a barbed wire fence in the forest south of Gotha. They had not expected to find it. There was nothing on their maps. There was nothing in their briefings. No intelligence report had mentioned a facility in this area. The commanding officer was Brigadier General Joseph F.H. Cutrona. Behind him, moving up in support, were the 89th Infantry Division under Major General Thomas D. Finley and the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. None of these men had been trained for what was inside. The fence was there. The wire was cut. And for a long moment, the American soldiers of the 4th Armored Division stood at the perimeter of Ohrdruf without moving. Then, slowly, from behind the barracks that were still standing, from the corners of the parade ground, from the shadows behind the sheds, figures began to appear. They came out slowly because they could not come out any other way. They wore the striped uniforms that every American in the coming years would come to recognize. Their faces were faces that the soldiers standing at the wire had no framework for. Their arms were the arms of people who had been given just enough food to continue working, and then not even that. They came out in silence because they did not yet know what an American soldier was going to do to them. One of the soldiers who walked through the gate that morning was an 18-year-old private from Ohio named Don Timmer. In high school, he had studied German because it was the language his grandmother spoke. It had seemed at the time like a small and ordinary choice. Standing inside the gate of Ohrdruf on the morning of the 4th of April, 1945, with 30 bodies lying on the ground between him and the first barracks, blood beneath them that had not yet fully darkened, some of it still wet, Don Timmer understood that the choice had not been ordinary at all. His sergeant handed him a notebook and a pencil. He became the interpreter. One by one, the survivors came forward and told him what had happened here. He wrote as fast as he could. He wrote down places he had never heard of. He wrote down methods he had never imagined. He wrote down the names of men who were no longer alive to speak for themselves. When his hand cramped, he switched hands and kept writing. The men speaking to him were not asking for revenge. They were asking to be believed. That was the first thing the Americans learned at Ohrdruf. Not what the SS had done, though they learned that too. The first thing they learned was that the survivors were afraid the world would not believe them, that someone, somewhere, someday would look at what had happened in this forest and decide that it was too large to be true. They had been afraid of that for a long time. Private David Cohen of the 4th Armored followed a smell to a wooden shed at the edge of the compound. He would later describe what he found inside in 3 sentences because 3 sentences were all he ever managed. He said the bodies were piled up like wood. He said there were no words to describe it. He said the smell was something he would never forget for the rest of his life. Inside the shed, stacked from the floor to well above waist height, were the bodies of approximately 40 men. They were naked. They had died of starvation. Their skin had been pulled tight against their bones until the bones were all that was left. They had been sprinkled with a thin layer of lime, not enough to break anything down, only enough, maybe, to reduce the smell by a degree or two, because there had been nowhere else to put them and no time left to do anything more. The lime had not been spread with any care. The men who had sprinkled it had been in a hurry. Outside the shed, around the perimeter, the 4th Armored Division's photographer walked with a speed graphic camera and took photographs that would eventually be entered into the archives of the United States National Archives and Records Administration. Some of those photographs show the bodies of SS men lying inside the camp, not shot by American soldiers, not killed in combat, killed by prisoners in the hours between the SS running and the Americans arriving. No American officer at Ohrdruf on the 4th of April made any serious effort to find out exactly who had done it. Some of the SS men had been captured alive. They were sitting in a corner of the compound with their hands on their heads, and they were being asked questions through Don Timmer. There was one question the Americans needed answered. Where were the other bodies? Because the survivors were saying. And Timmer was writing it down as fast as he could that there was a pit a mile from the camp past the tree line where approximately 3,000 men had been buried since the 1st of January. Men who had been shot in the head, men who had died of starvation, men whose hearts had simply stopped in the night from exhaustion and cold and the deliberate withdrawal of anything that might have kept them alive. The captured SS men did not want to answer. They looked at their boots. They looked at the sky. When they spoke at all, they spoke in short, careful sentences that did not contain the information anyone was asking for. The Americans did not need them. The prisoners took over. Men who could barely stand insisted on walking the perimeter with the American officers. They stopped at specific points and pointed and described and demonstrated. They used their own bodies to show what had been done to their bodies. At one corner of the parade ground, a group of survivors took an American officer aside and showed him a wooden device near the punishment post. Don Timmer did not need to translate what it had been used for. The word for what was being uncovered at Ohrdruf that first week traveled upward through the ordinary chain of military command, and it traveled further than anyone had anticipated. It reached 12th Army Group headquarters by afternoon on the 4th. It reached Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, by that evening. Within a week, it would reach General George S. Patton, Jr., who was going to fly to Ohrdruf, who was going to walk through that gate, who was going to stop at the door of a wooden shed and say out loud that he would be sick if he went inside, and who was then going to walk around the back of that shed out of the direct line of sight of his own soldiers and prove himself right. But that was 8 days away. For now, the gate was open, the wire was cut, and in the yard of a camp that had not existed on any map that morning, the survivors of Ohrdruf were standing in the April light, watching American soldiers try to find words for what they were looking at. There were no words. There had never been words for this. The men who had been asked to be believed were still waiting to find out if they would be. 30 miles to the east of Ohrdruf, inside a forest that looked like every other forest in Thuringia, there was a camp that the whole world had heard of. Buchenwald, not a subcamp, not a construction site with a code name. Buchenwald was the parent facility, one of the largest concentration camps the Reich had ever built, and by the second week of April 1945, it held tens of thousands of prisoners from across occupied Europe. It had been operating since 1937, 8 years, through the rise and the expansion and now the collapse of everything that had built it. And inside Buchenwald, in those first days of April, something was happening that no one on the outside knew about. In the basement of one of the camp's buildings, 2 men were crouched over a machine. The machine was a shortwave radio transmitter. It was not supposed to exist. It had been assembled over a period of months from components that had been stolen piece by piece from German supply stores and repair shops inside the camp. Every piece of it represented a death sentence if discovered. The men who had built it had known that. They had built it anyway. One of the men was Gwydion Damazon, a Polish engineer who had been inside Buchenwald long enough to have stopped counting the years. The other was Konstantin Ivanovich Leonov, a Soviet prisoner of war. Between them, they spoke enough languages to reach whoever might be listening. They did not know if anyone was listening. On the 11th of April, with the sound of American armor audible in the distance for the first time, they began to transmit. Damazin sent the message in English and in German. Leonov sent it in Russian. They sent it again and again into the static, into the silence, into the distance between them and whatever was out there on the other side of the wire. The message was short. This is the Buchenwald concentration camp. SOS. We request help. They want to evacuate us. The SS wants to destroy us. Then they waited. Somewhere in the signal network of the American Third Army, a radio operator heard something coming through the static. The message went up the chain, from a signaler to a section chief, from a section chief to a duty officer, from a duty officer to Third Army staff. And Third Army staff, without waiting for permission from anyone, sent an answer back down through the same static the message had come up through. The answer reached Damazin's headphones in 5 words. KZ Bu, haltet aus, eilen zu eurer Hilfe, Stab Dritte Armee, Buchenwald. Hold out, rushing to your aid, staff of Third Army. Guidan Damazin fainted at his desk. He had spent years inside that camp. He had watched men die in ways that he would never be able to fully describe to anyone who had not seen it. He had built a radio out of stolen pieces that could have gotten him executed a dozen times over. He had transmitted a message into silence without knowing if there was anyone on the other side of it. And the answer had come back in 5 words from an army that was already on its way. He was unconscious before the headphones left his ears. Inside Buchenwald, something else was already in motion. The underground resistance organization had been operating inside the camp for years. Not openly, not in any way that the SS command structure could see, but it had been there, organized, patient, accumulating what it needed, waiting for the moment when waiting was no longer the right response. They had spent months acquiring weapons, trading for them, stealing them, hiding them in places that the guards had searched 100 times without finding anything. They had built a structure of command inside the wire that the SS did not know existed. When the SS command inside Buchenwald began to panic, when the officers started burning documents and the guards started disappearing in 1s and 2s through the perimeter, the underground came out into the yard. They took the guard towers. They took the gates. They took the barracks. By the time the first American armor rolled up to the fence on the 11th of April, Buchenwald had already been liberated. Not by the army outside the wire, by the men who had been inside it. Some of the SS did not get out. The historical record says only that. Some of them did not get out. What happened to them in the hours between the guards running and the Americans arriving is recorded in the same silence that covers everything the survivors of those camps chose not to speak about for the rest of their lives. The Americans accepted that silence. They moved on. The order for the visit to Ohrdruf came from Dwight David Eisenhower. He was 54 years old. He was a full general of the United States Army and the supreme commander of Allied Expeditionary Force. He had spent the better part of 4 years managing the largest military coalition in the history of the Western world. He had planned the invasion of North Africa, the landings in Sicily, the crossing at Normandy. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He had been receiving reports from the field about Ohrdruf since the first week of April. He had read the cables. He had seen the photographs that the 4th Armored Division photographer had taken on the morning of the 4th. He had spoken with officers who had come back from the camp and could not stop talking about what they had seen, because talking was the only thing left to do with it. He decided he needed to see it himself, not because he was curious, not because he doubted the reports. He decided it because he was already thinking about the years after the war, about what would happen when a generation had passed and the men who had walked through these camps were old or gone. And someone stood up somewhere with a podium and a microphone and said that none of it had really happened, that the numbers had been exaggerated, that the photographs had been staged, that it had all been propaganda constructed by the victors to justify what they had done to the defeated. Eisenhower had seen enough of human nature to know that man was coming. He wanted to be able to look that man in the eye and say in his own voice, with his own words, that he had walked through the camp himself, that he had seen it, that he had smelled it, that he had stood in a wooden shed in a forest in central Germany and looked at what had been done to human beings by other human beings, and that no one would ever be able to tell him it hadn't happened because he had been there. He asked General Omar Bradley to come with him. Bradley was 52 years old, the commander of the 12th Army Group, and one of Eisenhower's most trusted colleagues across the entire span of the war. He agreed without hesitation. Eisenhower also asked General George Smith Patton, Jr. Patton was 59 years old. He had been a soldier for 40 years. He was the commander of the army that had actually liberated Ohrdruf, and he was the most aggressive fighting general the United States Army had produced in the entire war. He agreed to come. He wrote in his diary later that he had not wanted to. On the morning of the 12th of April, 1945, the three of them flew to an airfield near Gotha in Thuringia. They were driven in a small convoy through the towns that Patton's army had taken in the past week, past the shuttered windows and the white flags and the faces of people who watched the American vehicles pass without expression, and then into the forest south of the town. The convoy stopped at the gate of Ohrdruf. A man was waiting for them. He was thin in a way that made the word thin seem inadequate. His uniform, the striped uniform of the camp, hung from his body in loose folds that had nothing left underneath them to fill the fabric out. He had been inside this camp until 9 days ago. He had escaped when the evacuation began, survived whatever had happened on the road, and come back. He had come back to serve as their guide. He did not have a rank. He did not have a title. The historical record across all the cables and diaries and after-action reports that documented this visit in careful detail does not preserve his name. He is the man who walked Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley and George Patton through Ohrdruf on the morning of the 12th of April, 1945, and the world does not know what to call him. He led them past the bodies first. There were still bodies in the yard, still bodies near the barracks, still bodies near the pyre at the edge of the compound. The American soldiers who had been inside the camp since the 4th had made the decision not to move them until Eisenhower had seen them where they lay. So they lay where they had fallen, in the April light, in the open air of a forest in Germany. The guide walked slowly, because slowly was as fast as he could walk. He stopped at specific places and pointed and explained. He showed them the punishment posts near the fence, where men had been tied and beaten with wooden clubs, and where the ones who did not survive the beating had been taken to the pyre. He showed them the barracks where men had slept 4 to a wooden plank, stacked in tiers, in a space that had never been intended for sleep or for human beings. He showed them the place near the fence where, in the final days before the evacuation, the SS had gathered the last of the prisoners who were too sick to march and told them there was food on the parade ground. He showed them where the bodies had fallen when the guards opened fire. He showed them everything. And then he took them to the shed. It was a small building, wooden, no larger than a garden shed on an American farm, the kind of structure a man might use to store tools or seed or the equipment of an ordinary life. The door was open. The interior was dim. General Omar Bradley walked in. General Dwight Eisenhower walked in. Robert D. Murphy, the political advisor to Eisenhower who had made the drive out from headquarters to witness the visit, walked in. General George Smith Patton, Jr. stopped at the door. He stood at the threshold of that small wooden building and looked at what was inside. Stacked from the floor to well above waist height, the bodies of approximately 40 men, naked, starved down to the architecture of bone. A thin layer of lime scattered across them, not enough to do anything except mark the last desperate attempt of men who had been in too much of a hurry to do the job properly. Patton said out loud that he would be sick if he went in. He turned. He walked around the side of the shed. He went around the corner, out of the direct line of sight of his own soldiers, out of the frame of anyone's camera, out of the reach of anyone who might record what he was about to do. And then George Smith Patton, the man who had commanded the landings at Casablanca, who had driven his armor across Sicily in a race no one else believed was possible, who had stood on a pontoon bridge over the Rhine 3 weeks ago and performed for the cameras and for history, stood behind a wooden shed in a forest in Germany and vomited against the wall. He stayed there for a moment, just a moment. Then he wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and walked back around the corner. Eisenhower did not say anything to him. Not then, not in front of the others, not in front of the men from the camp who were watching from the yard, standing still in the April light, watching a man in a 4-star helmet come back from behind a wooden building. Those men did not look away. They did not say anything either. Eisenhower wrote about it later in the cable he sent to General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army in Washington. He did not write about it with judgment. He wrote about it the way a man writes down a fact that speaks for itself. He noted that in the room where 20 or 30 naked men had been piled, killed by starvation, George Patton had declined to enter. He had said he would be sick if he did. That was all Eisenhower said about it. It was enough. The tour continued because there was more to see. There was always more to see. The guide led them past the place where the bodies from the shed had been stacked when the shed was full, a clearing near the perimeter where the SS had built a pyre from railway ties and attempted to burn the dead before they ran. The pyre was still there, still recognizable for what it was, still carrying the evidence of what had been placed on it. Eisenhower kept walking. He walked the way a man walks when he has made a decision, and the decision is now behind him, and what is left is only the seeing. He had already, standing in that shed, made up his mind about what came next. He had decided, without announcing it to anyone yet, that the world was going to see what had been done here, that it was not going to be filed away in a classified archive and referenced in footnotes and slowly forgotten by a civilization that was ready to move on. The world was going to see it, and the Germans who had lived in the towns next to these camps, the people who had shopped in the markets and attended the churches and raised their children within sight of the smoke, were going to see it first. That decision had consequences that were already unfolding. A few days before Eisenhower's visit, American commanders at Ohrdruf had ordered local civilians from the nearby town to come to the camp. They had been brought in and walked through it. The mayor of the town had been required to make the tour with his wife. He had walked through it with her. He had seen what was in the yard and what was in the shed and what was in the pit, a mile past the tree line where 3,000 men had been buried since the 1st of January. That night, the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife went home to their house, and they hanged themselves. Their names were not preserved in the records that reached the American archives. What was preserved was the fact of what they had done and the date and the sequence of events that preceded it. They had seen the camp. They had gone home. They had not survived the night. What that meant, what it said about what they had known or suspected or chosen not to know, was a question that the historical record does not answer cleanly and perhaps cannot. Eisenhower read the report. He increased the order. On the 15th of April, 3 days after the visit to Ohrdruf, Patton flew to Weimar for a scheduled inspection of what he expected to be his next command post. General Walton Walker, one of his Corps commanders, was there to meet him. Walker mentioned in passing that as long as Patton was in the area, he might as well drive up the hill and take a look at Buchenwald. Patton went. He walked through Buchenwald with some of the same officers who had walked him through Ohrdruf 3 days before. He was a man who had, by now, stopped being capable of surprise at what these places contained. But he wrote about it anyway, in the same careful and specific voice he had used to write about Ohrdruf, because writing it down was the only form of witness he knew how to offer. He described the bunks, stacked 4 high, built at right angles to the narrow walkway between them, angled slightly forward so that whatever the bodies above produced ran downward onto the floor. He wrote that when he walked through the barracks, the filth on the floor was at least 3 inches deep. He wrote that the inmates he saw looked like, in his exact words, feebly animated mummies. He wrote it in the same steady hand he had used to write about everything else he had seen in 40 years of soldiering. That same afternoon, at the specific direction of Eisenhower, carried out by General Walker, 2,000 civilians from the city of Weimar were marched under armed American guard up the hill to Buchenwald. 2,000 people, brought there not as prisoners, not as suspects, brought there as witnesses, whether they wanted to be or not. They were shown the barracks. They were shown the crematorium, a brick building with the cremation furnaces that had, at peak operation, burned hundreds of bodies in a single day. They were shown the pile of remains outside the crematorium that had never made it into the furnaces because the fuel had run out before the killing did. Some of the civilians fainted. Some of them wept. Some of them, at various points along the route, stopped walking and refused to continue. The American soldiers behind them made it clear, without extended discussion, that this was not a request and this was not optional, and they were going to keep walking. They kept walking. On the 29th of April, 1945, at a camp called Dachau in Bavaria, not under Patton's Third Army, but under General Alexander Patch's Seventh Army, elements of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions came to the wire. What they found inside was not new by then. By the end of April, the American Army understood, in general terms, what a Nazi concentration camp was going to look like from the outside and from the inside. They had walked through enough of them. They had seen enough, but what happened at Dachau that afternoon was different. Before the soldiers entered the main compound, they passed a train parked on the tracks outside the camp, a long train, the kind of train that had been used to move prisoners from one camp to another as the Reich contracted under Allied pressure from both sides. The boxcars were not empty. They were full of bodies. Men who had died during the transport in the sealed cars, without water, without air, without any of the things that keep a human being alive for more than a few days. The soldiers who passed that train and then continued on into the camp carried what they had seen in those boxcars with them through the gate. A group of SS guards inside the camp surrendered. They put their weapons down. They put their hands on their heads. They were escorted to a corner of the compound near the coal yard, near a low wall, and placed under guard. An American officer gave an order. The soldiers with rifles opened fire. A number of SS men were killed against the wall of the coal yard. The exact count was disputed in the investigation that followed. It took, by the account of the officer who ran to stop it, about 30 seconds. That officer was Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the battalion commander for the sector. He ran to the scene and physically pushed his own soldiers' weapons down toward the ground. He was shouting. The shooting stopped. The United States Army investigated what happened at Dachau as a potential war crime. The investigation was eventually closed. No one was ever prosecuted. Patton's own diary, written weeks before Dachau, had already recorded a moment at Ohrdruf when a prisoner, in Patton's direct presence, killed a guard. He had watched it happen. He had not intervened. He had written it down afterward without comment, the way a man records something he has looked at from every angle and decided to accept. This is not the version of the story that fits neatly into a film. It is not the version where the lines are clear and the good men are purely good and the horror is contained entirely within the wire. It is what the record shows. Patton was not a saint. He was a professional soldier who had walked through a shed full of dead men and come out the other side of it with a set of convictions about justice and revenge that were a great deal closer to the men in his army than they were to the regulations in his office. He understood what his men had seen. He understood what it had done to them. He did not spend much time pretending otherwise. The Third Army did not stop moving. The war did not stop for what had been found at Ohrdruf or at Buchenwald or at Dachau. The front lines kept shifting. The Reich kept contracting. The camps kept being discovered one after another, each one requiring the American soldiers who entered it to find some way to absorb what they were looking at and keep walking and keep functioning, because the war was not over yet and there were still men to fight and ground to take. On the 23rd of April, the 90th Infantry Division, under Patton's command, reached a place called Flossenburg. On the 5th of May, 3 days before the war in Europe officially ended, the 11th Armored Division of the Third Army reached a camp in Austria called Mauthausen. Every one of them was worse than the soldiers had been prepared for. There was no preparation that would have been adequate. There was nothing in the manuals, nothing in the training, nothing in any of the accumulated experience of professional military service that covered what it meant to walk through the gate of a place where human beings had been systematically processed toward death for years. The soldiers walked through anyway, because that was the job, because someone had to, because the men inside the wire were still there, still alive, still waiting for someone to open the gate. And whatever it cost the men who opened it, the cost of not opening it was something no one was willing to calculate. Eisenhower's cable to General Marshall was already moving through the system. Within 72 hours of the visit to Ohrdruf, he had sent a formal request to Washington asking that members of the United States Congress and representatives of the American press be flown to the camps immediately. He wanted journalists. He wanted legislators. He wanted men who would go home and write about what they had seen and speak about what they had seen and put their names on the record alongside their testimony. He wanted the record to be so large and so dense and so populated with credible witnesses that no single voice, however loud, could ever talk over all of it. He was 54 years old when he made that decision. He already knew it was going to be necessary. The men who had asked Don Timmer to believe them on the morning of the 4th of April, when the blood on the parade ground was still wet, they had known it was going to be necessary too. They had known it from the beginning. They had been afraid of it from the beginning. And the fear it would turn out had not been irrational. But that part of the story belongs to the years after the war, and those years had not yet arrived. There was still a morning on the 12th of April that had not yet finished. There was still a man standing behind a wooden shed, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand, about to walk back around the corner. There was still a president 4,000 miles away, sitting for a portrait, and there was still a day that neither of them, Patton behind his shed or Roosevelt in his chair, was going to survive unchanged. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. He stood behind the shed for a moment. Just a moment. The wood of the wall was rough under his fingers. The forest around the camp was quiet in the way that forests in Germany were quiet in April. Birds, wind in the upper branches, the distant sound of engines somewhere on a road he couldn't see. He straightened up. He put his hands at his sides. And then General George Smith Patton, Jr. walked back around the corner of the shed. Eisenhower was waiting for him. Bradley was waiting for him. The prisoner guide, the thin man with no name in any record, was waiting for him. And behind them, in the yard of Ohrdruf, the survivors of the camp were standing in the April light, watching a man in a 4-star helmet come back from behind a wooden building. They did not look away. They did not say anything. Patton did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was not about what he had just done behind the shed. It was about what needed to happen next. He had been a soldier for 40 years. 40 years had given him exactly one tool for moments like this one. He kept walking. The tour continued for another hour. The unnamed guide led them past the rest of what Ohrdruf contained, past the punishment posts, past the barracks, past the place near the perimeter where the pyre had been built from railway ties and the bodies had been stacked on it, and the SS had thrown fuel on it and had not had enough time to finish what they started. Eisenhower walked through all of it without stopping unnecessarily. He looked at what he was shown. He asked questions in a quiet voice. He did not perform grief, and he did not perform outrage. He moved through the camp the way a man moves through something he has already decided to carry for the rest of his life, with a kind of deliberate, quiet attention that is more frightening in its way than any open display of emotion. When the tour was finished, they walked back to the vehicles. They drove to the airfield. They flew back toward headquarters in the late afternoon light over Thuringia, over the forests and the rivers and the roads full of the wreckage of a war that was almost over. And somewhere on that drive to the airfield, or somewhere at the airfield itself, or somewhere in the air between Gotha and headquarters, one of the three men was told. Then the second, then the third. The historical record does not agree on the exact sequence. It does not agree on who heard it first, or who told whom, or what the first words of the telling were. What the record agrees on is that by the time they landed, all three of them knew. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. He had been sitting for a portrait that afternoon at a small house in Warm Springs, Georgia. The President of the United States had been sitting in a chair while an artist worked on his likeness. He was 63 years old. He had been president for 12 years. He had led his country through the Great Depression and through the first years of the worst war in human history. He had sat with Churchill and with Stalin and had argued in rooms that the public never saw about what the world was going to look like when the killing stopped. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 12th of April, 1945, he raised his hand to his temple. He said one sentence. He said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Then he lost consciousness. He was pronounced dead a few hours later of a cerebral hemorrhage. He had not known when he sat down for that portrait that the armies he had sent to Europe were walking through concentration camps that morning. He had not known about Ohrdruf. He had not known about the shed, or the guide with no name, or the man who had walked around the back of a wooden building and been sick against the wall. He never would. The news crossed the Atlantic in the way that news crossed the Atlantic in 1945 by cable, by radio, by the chain of communication that ran from signal post to signal post across an ocean that separated the world where the dying was happening from the world where the decisions were being made. It reached Supreme Headquarters that evening. It reached the Third Army Command Post later than that. It reached the men who had been at Ohrdruf that afternoon after they had already done what they had come to do. Patton wrote about it that night in his diary. He wrote about the pyre. He wrote about the shed. He wrote about the pit a mile past the tree line where 3,000 men had been buried since the 1st of January. He wrote about the survivors and what they had said to Don Timmer and what Timmer had written down with both hands in a notebook that a sergeant had handed him. Then he wrote about Roosevelt. He wrote the two things next to each other in the same day's entry, in the same steady hand, as if the man holding the pen could not quite make himself believe that both of these things had happened on the same afternoon. That a man could stand in a forest in Germany and look at what had been done to human beings in the dark, and then be told on the drive home that the president was gone. Both of these things had happened on the same afternoon. That was all. 3 days later, on the 15th of April, Patton flew to Weimar. He had a scheduled visit, a command post inspection, the ordinary administrative business of running an army that was still fighting a war that was not yet over. General Walton Walker met him there. Walker mentioned in passing that as long as Patton was in the area, it might be worth driving up the hill to see Buchenwald. Patton went. He walked through Buchenwald with some of the same officers who had walked him through Ohrdruf. He was 3 days further into whatever Ohrdruf had done to him, and he moved through Buchenwald like a man who had stopped being capable of surprise, but had not stopped being capable of witness. He wrote about it with the same precision he had brought to every other thing he had ever written about. The bunks stacked 4 high, angled forward. The filth on the floor 3 inches deep. The inmates, his phrase recorded in his own handwriting, like feebly animated mummies. He wrote it down. That same afternoon, by the direct order of Eisenhower, carried out by Walker, 2,000 civilians from the city of Weimar were marched under armed American guard up the hill to Buchenwald. 2,000 people from a city that was 4 miles from the camp, a city of concert halls and universities, and the memory of Goethe, who had walked these same hills 150 years before and written about beauty and nature and the inner life of man. 2,000 people who had lived 4 miles from this. They were shown the barracks. They were shown the crematorium. They were shown the cremation furnaces that had, at peak operation, burned hundreds of bodies in a single day. They were shown the pile of remains outside the furnace building that had never made it inside because the fuel had run out before the war did. Some of them fainted. Some of them wept. Some of them, at certain points along the route, stopped walking. The American soldiers behind them did not raise their voices. They did not need to. They simply made it clear in the way that armed men make things clear without saying them aloud that the walk was not finished, and it was not going to be finished until it was finished. The civilians kept walking. What they thought as they walked, what they said to each other that night in their houses in Weimar in the dark, is not in the record. The record contains only what the American soldiers observed: fainting, weeping, stopping, continuing. What the record does not contain are the conversations that happened afterward in the houses of Weimar with the doors closed. Those conversations were private. The record has no access to them. The last thing worth saying about Ohrdruf before this story moves toward its end is not about a general. It is about a question. Eisenhower had asked the same question in slightly different forms in every cable he sent and every conversation he had in the weeks after the visit. He had asked it not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood that the asking was itself part of the record. He asked how it was possible for human beings to have done this. He asked what it meant that the towns beside the camps had functioned normally year after year, while the smoke rose and the transports arrived and the numbers inside the wire kept changing. He did not expect anyone to answer it cleanly. He knew it could not be answered cleanly. What he did with the question was put it in the record and keep moving. On the 28th of September, 1945, 5 months after Ohrdruf, 4 months after Germany surrendered, Dwight David Eisenhower relieved George Smith Patton, Jr. of his position as military governor of Bavaria. The reasons were not secret. Patton had, in the months between the liberation and the relief, said things in public that he should not have said. At a press conference in the town of Bad Tolz, he had compared members of the Nazi Party to members of the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. He had suggested that most of them had joined the party because they had felt they had no choice, the way a man might join a union or a civic organization, and that treating them all as committed ideologues was a practical mistake. He had resisted the American denazification program, the systematic removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in the civil administration of Bavaria. He had said to reporters and to officers and to anyone who would listen that if you removed every former party member from every position of responsibility, you would have no one left to run the trains or administer the courts or keep the water running in the cities. He was not entirely wrong about the practical problem. He was entirely wrong about the moment. Eisenhower had heard enough. In early October, he transferred Patton from command of the Third Army, the army he had led from Normandy to the Rhine to the forests of Thuringia, to command of the 15th Army. The 15th Army was not a fighting force. It had almost no soldiers. Its assignment was to compile and preserve the historical record of the war in Europe. The man who had stood behind the shed at Ohrdruf and vomited against the wall was now sitting at a desk, writing history. He hated it. He made no secret of hating it. He had spent his entire adult life in motion and command in the field at the front of something moving forward. Sitting at a desk in a headquarters building in a country that had stopped fighting was not something he had any practice with, and he had no patience for acquiring it. He wrote in his diary about the assignment the way he wrote about everything, directly, without softening anything. He was bored. He was diminished. He was a general without a war, which was the only thing he had ever fully understood how to be. On the 9th of December, 1945, near the city of Mannheim in the American occupation zone of Germany, General George Smith Patton, Jr. was riding in the back seat of a Cadillac Model 75 staff car. He was on his way to a pheasant hunt. His driver was Private First Class Horace Woodring. Woodring was 20 years old. He had been driving Patton for long enough to know the general's preferences, how fast, which route, where to slow down, and where to push through. It was an ordinary morning in December in occupied Germany. Cold, gray, the kind of morning that felt like every other morning in the occupation zone, which all felt like waiting for something that was not coming. At an intersection on the outskirts of Mannheim, an American Army truck made a sudden turn at low speed. The Cadillac hit the truck. It was not a high-speed collision. It was not a dramatic crash. It was the kind of accident that happens at intersections at low speed without warning, and that most of the time results in bent metal and paperwork and nothing more. Woodring was not seriously hurt. Patton was thrown forward in the back seat. His head struck the metal partition that divided the front compartment from the rear. The partition was solid. The blow was direct. He was paralyzed from the neck down by the time they got him out of the car. He was taken to the United States Army Hospital at Heidelberg. His wife, Beatrice, was in Massachusetts when the call came. She was on a plane before the day was out. She flew across the Atlantic, and she was with him when he woke up in the hospital bed and understood what had happened to him and what it meant. He was conscious. He was lucid. He knew where he was, and he knew what the paralysis meant, and he was not a man who had ever needed anything explained to him twice. He spent 12 days in that hospital. On the 21st of December, 1945, General George Smith Patton, Jr. died in his sleep of heart failure. He was 60 years old. He had turned 60 the month before, on the 11th of November, Armistice Day, the day the guns of the first war he had fought in had fallen silent 27 years before the second one took everything he had left to give it. He had asked, before the accident, to be buried alongside the men of the Third Army who had died in the fighting for the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the worst winter of the war, the battle that had cost the Third Army more than almost any other single engagement. His wish was honored. His grave is at the American Military Cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg. It is a small white cross in a field of small white crosses. There is no larger marker. There is nothing on it to indicate that the man buried under it held 4 stars, or commanded 800,000 soldiers, or crossed the Rhine, or walked through the shed at Ohrdruf, or stood behind a wooden wall in a forest in Germany and was sick against the boards. That was how he had asked to be buried, among his men, the same as his men. The soldiers who had been at Ohrdruf came home. Private Don Timmer of the 89th Infantry Division came home to Ohio. He came back to the state where he had studied German in high school because it was his grandmother's language. Not knowing what that language was going to require of him, not knowing that one April morning he was going to stand in a yard with a notebook and a pencil and be handed the testimony of men who needed to be believed. Private David Cohen of the 4th Armored Division came home. Most of them did not talk about it, not in any sustained way. not in the way you might expect men to talk about the most significant thing they had ever seen. When they did speak at reunions, in interviews, in the occasional conversation with a son or a grandchild who had asked the right question in the right moment, they came back to the same short sentences they had used in April of 1945. The bodies were piled up like wood. There were no words to describe it. The smell was something you never forget. They did not add to those sentences. They did not elaborate or contextualize or build the sentences out into something longer and more complete. The sentences were already everything. There was nothing outside them that needed to be said. That is what the record shows. Eisenhower lived to be 78 years old. He was elected President of the United States twice. He served 2 terms. He was in office during the Korean War and the early years of what would become Vietnam and the long, grinding opening decades of the Cold War. He made decisions that historians still argue about. He did things well, and he did things badly. And he was a complicated man who had held more responsibility for longer than almost anyone in the 20th century. Every year, for the rest of his life, on the 12th of April, he remembered what he had seen inside a wooden shed in a forest in Thuringia on the day President Roosevelt died. He had written in the cable to General Marshall the sentence that would be quoted more often than almost any other sentence any American general spoke about the Second World War. He had written it in plain language, the language of a man who understood that the moment required clarity above everything else. He wrote that the American soldier had been told for years that he did not know what he was fighting for. He wrote that now, at least, the American soldier knew what he was fighting against. He was 54 years old when he wrote it. He was right. There is one more thing. Ohrdruf does not exist today in any physical form that you could visit. The structures were dismantled. The site was absorbed into a Soviet military installation after the war, and what had been there before was erased by the buildings and the fences and the ordinary operations of a military base that had no interest in preserving what it was built on top of. The pit past the tree line, the one the survivors had pointed toward, the one where 3,000 men had been buried since the 1st of January, was eventually located and documented by American investigators. The documentation is in the archives. The pit is not marked. What remains of Ohrdruf is paper, cables, diary entries, photographs taken with a speed graphic camera on the morning of the 4th of April by a photographer who understood, with whatever part of a soldier understands things like this, that what he was photographing was not a military objective. It was evidence. Evidence for the man Eisenhower already knew was coming. The man with the podium and the microphone who would stand up in some year Eisenhower could not name but could clearly see, and say that none of it had really happened. The photographs are in the National Archives of the United States. They are available to anyone who wants to look at them. The diary entries are there too. Patton's, Eisenhower's, the cables to Marshall, the after-action reports of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry and the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, the testimony of Don Timmer, the testimony of David Cohen, the records of what the unnamed guide showed to 3 American generals on a morning in April when the president was dying and the war was almost over and the shed door was open and the lime had not worked. All of it is there. All of it is preserved. All of it is waiting. That is what happened at Ohrdruf on the 4th and the 12th of April, 1945. That is what General George Smith Patton, Jr. did behind a wooden shed on the day the President of the United States died. He was sick against a wall. Then he came back around the corner, and he kept walking.